Добрый вечер. Давайте начинать. Пожалуйста, рассаживайтесь. Спасибо, что пришли, несмотря на ураган, реновацию и другие опасности, которые поджидают нас в современной Москве. Вот. Меня зовут Илья Винявкин, я директор образовательных программ проекта In Liberty, и мы продолжаем цикл лекций, который называется «Зомби-идеи». Да, это уже, если я ничего не путаю, 6-я лекция из этого цикла. Наша задумка была, в принципе, очень простой. Да, мы, когда думали о том, какая может быть тема для такого большого лекционного разговора, то мы подумали, что важный предмет, о котором мы не очень много говорим, это идея о том, что сами по себе какие-то идеи, да, они могут быть вредными или полезными. Да, и что одна плохая идея может принести миру больше вреда, чем много каких-то вполне себе конкретных злонаправленных действий. Да. А проблема еще с идеями в том, что часто они бывают, то, что называется, за ними могут стоять добрые намерения. И наша задача как раз заключается в том, да, чтобы попробовать обзавестись таким инструментарием, который мог бы нам помочь отделять идеи вредоносные от идей, которые или такого вреда не несут, или, наоборот, могут нам помочь сделать окружающую нас реальность лучше. И вот, в частности, да, вот с начала года, я не знаю, если вы следили за нами или нет, мы успели поговорить об опасности идей геополитики, об опасности идеи обязательной нормализации, да, о том, что в мире должна существовать норма, к которой мы всех будем теми или иными способами приводить, об опасности идеи регулирования, да, и об опасности идеи, например, которая заключается в том, что люди могут облагодетельствовать других людей помимо их воли. Вот, да, опять-таки, да, чтобы вы понимали, у нас нету такого соображения, что то, что мы здесь будем говорить, это истина в последней инстанции. Одно из, как нам кажется, качеств хорошей, качественной зомби-идеи в том, что она вообще-то сохраняет часть своего обаяния. Да, говорить о том, что уже всем, очевидно, не работает, да, там, условно говоря, в этом цикле говорить о гомеопатии нам кажется странным. Да, поэтому в том числе наша задача, да, посмотреть через эти очки зомби-идеи на какие-то соображения, которые часто нам самим, в том числе, кажутся разумными. Вот. И вот сегодня мы пригласили Дэвида Фридмана, экономиста, правоведа и журналиста, поговорить о такой идее, которую мы назвали, зомби-провидец. Зомби-провидец – это такой человек, который считает, что он может очень хорошо и эффективно предсказывать будущее. Да, и вот на основании этого предлагать варианты его исправления. Да, вот, например, если он там смотрит на какую-нибудь демографическую кривую, он понимает, говорит, здесь через 30 лет будут проблемы, значит, нам нужно вот здесь принять такие-то законы, да, применить такое-то регулирование, и тогда этих проблем не станет. И вот сегодня Дэвид расскажет вам о том, к чему такие идеи могут привести. Чтобы вы понимали, как все это будет устроено, лекция займет примерно 45-50 минут, а потом у вас у всех будет возможность задать вопрос. Спасибо. Дэвид?
Thank you. I hope he said nice things about me, but I don't understand Russian. I could, yes. The subject of my talk today is the future and how to deal with it. There are basically two ways of responding to change over time. One of them is to try to control it, and one of them is to try to adapt to it. If I observe that my belt is getting tight, one thing I can do is to go on a diet in order that it won't. A different thing I can do is to buy a new pair of pants that are a little bit looser. In the case of individual choice, sometimes one of those makes sense and sometimes the other. But I am going to argue that if you think about the same issue in wider contexts with global problems such as population growth or climate change, that it almost never makes sense to try to control and usually makes sense to adapt. So if you think of the same issue in the climate context, you can try to control climate change by burning less fossil fuel, putting out less CO2, and thus slowing warming. Or you can adapt to climate change by waiting 80 or 90 years, and when sea level has gone up by about a meter, which is the high end of the current estimate for the end of this century, you build dikes that are a meter high. If you're a farmer and temperature has gone up by a few degrees centigrade, you shift to crops that are currently being grown a few hundred kilometers farther south where it's warmer, and thus crops that are adapted to a warmer climate. So those are, again, two different approaches. And in the spirit of this series of talks, I am going to argue that the zombie solution is trying to change the future, and the sensible solution is observing what happens in the future and then dealing with it. And there are several different reasons why I believe that trying to control the future is usually a mistake. And the first reason is that to control it, you have to know what it is going to be. I first encountered this issue back about 50 years ago, when the crisis that was supposed to be destroying the world was not climate change, but population growth. And at that time, there were people seriously arguing that in the 1970s, there were going to be global famines that would kill hundreds of millions of people, and that it was too late to stop them. That all that could be done was to decide which hundreds of millions you could save and which hundreds of millions would have to die. That didn't happen. What in fact happened was precisely the opposite of the prediction, that instead of global famine, per capita calorie consumption in the poor countries of the world went up. We have now reached a point where being fat is a problem for poor people as well as for rich people, which I think has never been true before in the history of the world. So in that case, things that one does to deal with population change could easily make things worse rather than better. All right. Let me take the case of climate change, which is the current issue. What climate change will occur and what its effects will be is a very difficult problem, a much more difficult problem than most people assert. To begin with, the science is fairly unsure. It's clear that more CO2 will tend to make things warmer, but it's not at all clear by how much. If you actually follow the predictions made by the IPCC, I at one point went back and reread the first 3 reports. And for each report I said, if this is all I read, what would I expect to happen from then till now? And the answer is that if I believed the first report, I would expect warming somewhere in a range, the bottom end of which was above what actually happened. For the second and third report, they did not do as badly, but consistently, for the early reports, the late reports we haven't had long enough to judge, but for the early reports, they were consistently estimating on the high end. So what actually happened tended to be towards the low end of their predictions. That doesn't mean they're doing a bad job. Climate is an extremely complicated system. The sort of fundamental number, which is how much, what's called climate sensitivity, how much warming you get for a given amount of CO2, is something we don't know. People disagree within about a factor of 2 range on what it is. So that's sort of the simplest problem. Second, for all the effects other than warming, we don't actually know what they will be. If you read the IPCC reports, the 4th report, which was the next to most recent, said that global warming was causing drought. The 5th report retracted that claim. They said that as far as they know, there was not good evidence that global warming was causing drought. At various points, various people have said that global warming will result in hurricanes. So far, it does not seem to have happened. And it is apparently, this is not my field, but from the things I read, people in the field are uncertain. One prediction is that it will make hurricanes a little stronger and a little less common, and there are other predictions from other people. So even if we knew how much CO2 there was going to be, it would be hard to tell what the climate consequences would be in any detail. Furthermore, we do not know what the CO2 input is going to be, because we're talking about a long and uncertain future. Solar power has been getting cheaper over time. If it keeps getting cheaper, people are going to stop burning fossil fuel because it'll be cheaper to use solar power. Similarly, if there are improvements in nuclear power that make it cheaper than fossil fuel, which hasn't happened yet, people will stop burning fossil fuel. So the amount they're going to burn is itself a very uncertain number, whether or not we try to do anything about it. Finally, even if we knew how much CO2 there was going to be and what the effect would be on climate, it is then very hard to predict what the effect of those changes will be on human beings. If climate goes up, people will change the crops they're growing. We don't really know whether in the hottest places they will succeed in adapting. We don't know to what degree places that are now too cold for growing crops, people will be able to find crops that grow there when it gets a little warmer. So the world is very complicated. One of the least certain effects is that with more CO2 in the air, the ocean pH goes down, which means the ocean becomes less basic than it now is, moves towards neutral. There's nothing inherently bad about that, but living creatures are all adapted to their existing environment, and we don't know how large the effect on aquatic life will be of that change. Part of the reason that this uncertainty matters is it is not merely an uncertainty about how bad climate change is. It's an uncertainty about whether it is bad. Because if you actually look at the different facts, different ways in which climate change affects people, it turns out that there are good effects and there are bad effects. Both of them are substantial, both of them are uncertain, and the result is that the sign of the sum is not currently known. We don't actually know whether on net we are better off or worse off putting CO2 into the air. If you think about, generally when people talk about climate change, they talk about it as if it was inherently a bad thing. And that's what strikes me as an extraordinarily conservative bias, the assumption that any change from what we now have is bad. In fact, climate change has some negative effects. It will result in sea level rise, although not very much. People tend to greatly exaggerate that. As I say, the estimate, the IPC high-end estimate for the year 2100 is about 1 meter of sea level rise. For the US East Coast, I've seen the figures, and 1 meter of sea level rise shifts the coastline in by 100 meters. Shifting a coastline in by 100 meters is invisibly small on a map. So you're talking about a change which will be serious in a few places. If you look at the Nile Delta, for example, you get a substantial shift with even 1 meter on the Nile Delta. You get not as large an effect, but a significant effect in Bangladesh, which is very low-lying. In most of the world, the effect is essentially invisible because most places the coast isn't perfectly flat. But that's a negative effect. On the other hand, at the moment, human land use is limited by cold, not by heat. If you look at a globe of the Earth, you will notice that the center part, the hottest part, the equator, is heavily settled, and the poles are empty. Essentially, nobody lives in Antarctica, very few people live in Greenland, not even all that many people in Siberia and Alaska, which are about as, or northern Sweden and Norway. So one effect of warming is that the line at which land is usable by humans moves towards the poles, which means that there is an increase in the amount of usable land. and you would then have to compare that gain to the loss due to sea level rise reducing land. Similarly, when people talk about the effects of global warming, they talk correctly about the fact that you will get hotter summers and that very hot summers kill people. But of course, you will also get mild winters, and very cold winters kill people. There was, in fact, a journal article in The Lancet, I believe, a British publication a fair while back, which tried to estimate total global deaths from cold versus from heat. And the calculation they made was that almost 20 times as many people die from cold as from heat. Now, it's much more complicated to figure out how the change due to global warming will affect things, but that certainly tells you that it is not clear that the net effect of that is negative. There is one large positive effect, which we actually know, and that's that when you increase the amount of CO2 in the air, plants produce a larger crop yield because CO2 is an input to photosynthesis. It turns out there are two different kinds of plants in terms of photosynthesis, what are called C3 and C4 plants. C3 plants, if you double the CO2, you increase yield by about 30%. C4, the effect is still positive but much smaller. Most food crops are C3, a few important ones are C4. The most certain effect associated with climate change is the increase in CO2 because that's what's causing everything else. So if, as is projected, you double CO2 concentration, we know one direct result would be larger crop yields. There will then be a variety of uncertain indirect effects, some of which may be negative. There might be droughts, there might not be droughts, there may be more flooding from heavy rain, there are various other things that could happen. So the basic point I'm making is that we simply do not know whether we should be stopping or encouraging global warming. And if we think we should be slowing global warming, we don't know how hard we should try, how large a price and other things we should pay in order to slow it. Similarly, if I go to the other global problem, the older global problem of overpopulation, the result of people trying to control it was the one-child policy in China. It was a similar but less extreme policy in Singapore. China is gradually admitting that the one-child policy is a mistake, and they've been gradually easing up. But like most people, the Chinese government doesn't like to admit mistakes. I don't like to admit mistakes either. I wouldn't even be astonished if you don't like to admit mistakes. On the other hand, the government of Singapore, which adopted policies in order to slow population growth back then, has now reversed its position and is adopting policies designed to increase population growth. And as you probably know, a good many European countries, Russia among them, people are seriously worried about declining population and the population aging as a result. So that is a case where it looks as though the policies that were adopted were probably pushing in the opposite of the right direction. Although, again, we don't know for certain. Maybe it'll turn out in another 20 years that population really is a problem. So my general point is that one disadvantage to trying to control the future is that for this kind of problem, for large issues involving long periods of time, the future is sufficiently uncertain so we don't really know what we want to do. There's a second problem. Economists use the term public good problem for the problem of something where if I do it, most of the benefit goes to other people, and therefore I have little incentive to do it. And the argument in favor of government policies to reduce carbon dioxide production is that each individual person has no incentive to do it because each individual person knows that his contribution is very small, so you have to get everybody to do it. The problem with that argument in that case, however, is that for a global problem like CO2, it is not only a public good problem at the individual level, it is a public good problem at the national level. If Sweden does something to reduce CO2, that if it produces a benefit at all, if we believe global warming is bad, that benefit mostly goes to other countries. So therefore, they have little incentive to do it. Similarly for Russia and similarly for many, many other countries. Furthermore, it's an even worse situation with climate change, because whether it is a benefit or a loss is probably something that depends on the country. If you have a country that's fairly far north, it is quite likely that warming is good, because in countries that are fairly far north, it's usually too cold, not too hot. On the other hand, a country like India, where there are substantial areas that are already getting close to as hot as humans can stand, global warming is almost certainly a bad thing. Mr. Putin says that he doesn't believe in global warming. My theory is that he does believe in global warming, and he can look at a map. And he can observe that most of Russia is in places where people are happy being warmer. I may be wrong, I can't read his mind, but I think that's a plausible explanation. So it makes it hard to control a problem when each country has different interests, and some of the countries are better off pushing one way and some of the countries better off pushing in the other direction. Now let's consider the alternative approach of adapting to change instead of trying to prevent change. Adapting to change, you don't have to predict what's going to happen 100 years from now. All you have to do is see what's happening now. If sea level is rising a little bit, build your dikes a little higher. Don't build your houses right next to the ocean. The effect of sea level rise, as I say, is actually pretty small in most places, but in the places where it does really matter, build dikes. The Dutch, after all, have been living below sea level for many hundreds of years. I believe that the lowest Dutch city is something like 8 meters below sea level, if I remember correctly. And they did it by diking, and they did it originally with medieval technology. So that is an option, at some cost, of course. But the main point is that you don't have to predict in order to deal with change. You can just observe, which is much easier to do. As one American once said, an often quoted line, prediction is hard, especially about the future. Similarly, if you're a farmer, if you observe that summers are getting a little hotter and winters are getting a little milder, you can say, all right, I've been growing a particular strain of maize, of corn, for the last 30 years, but maybe I should try what some of my neighbors are doing, try shifting to a strain that's adapted to a slightly warmer climate. If there's more rain, similarly. If there's less rain, maybe I should put in some irrigation. So in the case of adapting to change, you can see what happens and then make your decisions as it happens. Furthermore, adapting is closer to a private good than preventing. By that I mean that some forms of adaptation, if I adapt, I get the benefit. If I am a farmer and I shift crops to something suited to the new climate, the result is that I get a good harvest. Doesn't do my neighbors any good, they can do it for themselves. If I observe that sea level is rising, and so when I build a house by the ocean, I build it 50 feet in from high tide or 100 feet in, I have the benefit of a house that doesn't flood. Some parts of adapting have to be done on a larger scale. If you want to dike Bangladesh, you probably can't do it one house at a time. But even there, you can do it one country at a time, or in some other places, one city at a time. So it is not a problem that has to be dealt with on a global scale, and it is easier to coordinate people the smaller the number of people you are coordinating. So that means that adaptation has the dual advantage that it doesn't require you to predict, and that it is easier to make it happen because much of it is in the private interest of the people who do it, and people are pretty good about acting in their own private interest. And when it isn't in the private interest, it is likely to be in the interest of some group smaller than the population of the world. All right? there's one more advantage to adaptation, and that is that if you prevent climate change, you prevent both the good parts and the bad parts. All right, if we could somehow stop putting out CO2 tomorrow, which we can't, but if you imagine we could, that would slow warming, but we also wouldn't get the crop increase from more CO2 in the air. If we managed to slow warming, that would reduce the problem of people dying in hot summers, but we would be left with the problem of people dying in cold winters, which would have been reduced if we hadn't stopped it. On the other hand, when you adapt to change, you can adapt to the bad parts and still take advantage of the good parts. So if you adapt to to the temperatures going up, one way you adapt over 100 years is that people move out of the hottest parts of India, and people move into the northern edge of Canada and Alaska and Russia and Scandinavia. Moving people may sound hard, but we're talking about long periods of time. Back when my grandparents came to America, which was, I think, just before World War I, as I remember, America was accepting about 1 million immigrants a year. At 1 million people a year, you can move a lot of people in a century. And of course, that was just one country, and that was in America that was a third the population it is now. So the equivalent would be 3 million. So the general argument I'm offering is that if you adapt, you can both get the benefits and at least reduce. You can't eliminate the costs. Those are real costs. But you can get most of the good side and get rid of a good deal of the bad side. So that's the basic argument that I'm offering for why adaptation is usually a better strategy than trying to stop the future, as it were, than trying to block it. And I know there was one American writer who argued that the big political division of the future is going to be between the people who see the future as something to be stopped, the people whose basic instinct is the conservative instinct, we like the world the way it is, prevent change, and the people whose view is you can't stop change, you have to learn to live with it, to take advantage of those changes you can take advantage of, and live with the changes that you can't take advantage of. Let me now go on from the general discussion of these particular issues to discuss a broader point, which is that I believe the future is a great deal more uncertain than people usually assume. The most recent book I published was a book called Future Imperfect. And Future Imperfect is about technological revolutions that might happen and what their effects would be. And after I published that book, I was invited to give a talk on it at Google. I live fairly close to where Google has its offices. And I started the talk by saying that I thought that global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe. So in 100 years, sea level goes up by 1 meter, global temperatures go up by 3 or 4 degrees centigrade. I've got 3 ways of wiping out the human race faster than that. And I do. I won't, if you want to hear what those ways are, the YouTube of the talk I gave at Google is linked to my webpage. My webpage, by the way, is daviddfriedman.com, if you can remember that. And you can see that one, so I won't go through. But my point was that the future is sufficiently uncertain that there are things which could happen which would result in there being no human beings 100 years from now. And there are other things that could happen that would result in human beings living lives enormously better than they now do 100 years from now. Let me give you some examples, some of which might affect climate change, some of which might not. And I will start with the fact that a couple of days ago, I gave a talk in Georgia. That was the first time I had been in Georgia, but the second time I had given a talk in Georgia. All right? Some point, I think less than a year ago, I gave a talk in Georgia, and I gave it from my office in San Jose, California. All right? I was using Skype. I had my computer had a camera pointed at me. The people in Georgia had a video camera pointed at the audience. The result was that I was seeing the audience in my computer, and they were seeing me in a screen in the room they were doing it. And I was thus able to give a talk in Georgia without actually being in Georgia. Now, there are advantages to being in Georgia. The food seems to be pretty good. I enjoyed my visit to Batumi, but it was a lot harder to get there this time than it was the previous time. And I'm mentioning this case because it suggests one of the ways in which the world is changing. That as we get better and better at virtual reality, it becomes easier and easier to do our trips the way I did my first trip to Georgia instead of the second one. That the more people are doing their interaction online, the less need there is to fly airplanes around. The less need there is to drive cars around. The less of that happens, the less carbon dioxide goes into the air. Many other things change as well. I remember that I was thinking at one point of what it would be like if you had good enough virtual reality so people could really spend many hours in virtual reality. And then it eventually occurred to me that, oddly enough, I was spending many hours in virtual reality. Because the real high tech is not the software that shows the world. The real high tech is the human imagination. And using technology I already had, namely a computer screen and a speaker, I could spend many hours wandering around a place called Azeroth in World of Warcraft, which was an interaction with other human beings that was happening entirely online. So one can imagine, as that set of changes goes farther and farther, people living more and more of their life online, less and less of their life moving around in real space. And the extreme version of that is what I think of as what happens when we crack the dreaming problem. After all, there's a sense in which all of us spend time in virtual reality every night. You are seeing and hearing things that aren't really happening when you're dreaming. If we understood enough about the human brain, we could forget about the screen and the speaker, pipe the information directly into your brain, and you could have the illusion of living on the California coast, of eating sushi, because after all, taste is something that happens in the brain, not on the tongue. And you could therefore imagine my sort of one of my many extremely different futures is the one where we're all living in little cubicles and we're eating soybean mush, but that's just what our physical bodies are doing. For our mind, we are living wherever in the world we like best in mansions. We are eating whatever our favorite food is, Baskin-Robbins ice cream, for those familiar with that delicious product, chocolate chip cookies, which I believe are the greatest contribution to world cuisine of the 20th century, sushi if you like sushi, borscht if you like borscht. That would be one of the many ways in which the world that you will end up in when you're old people could be entirely different from the world you live in. Speaking of which, it is not entirely clear that most of you will ever become old people. It may not have occurred to you that everybody in this room is dying of an incurable disease. The disease is called aging. It has been the case throughout the history of our species that everybody grows old and die. There is no very good reason why that has to keep happening. If you think about the problem of preventing aging as an engineering problem, it should occur to you that the information needed to rebuild your body exists in every cell of your body, because the design spec for your body is your DNA. If you have information that exists in millions or hundreds of millions of copies, it is very hard to lose it. It's massively redundant. Now, it's a very hard engineering problem, which is why we haven't solved it yet. On the other hand, if you think about the amount of progress there has been in medicine and biology just in the last century, we have essentially learned more in the last century than in the previous 500,000 years. All right? I'm not sure how many modern people appreciate the fact that until about 1920, a doctor who said he could cure you was almost always lying. There were a few exceptions. There were a few things such as scurvy, which is a vitamin C deficiency, which they actually knew how to cure. But for the most part, all an honest doctor could do was to predict. He could say, what you've got is something that usually you'll get over in another week. Or he could say, sorry about that, you had better make your will. But with rare exceptions, doctors couldn't cure anything. Nowadays, the situation is the opposite. It was a great shock to the world when a disease appeared that we had no cure for, AIDS. And at this point, in some sense, we do have cures, not perfect cures, but ways of arranging that people who have AIDS won't die very fast. All right? It used to be that measles was like that. All right? In 1900, measles was killing many more people than AIDS kills today. We've made enormous progress in the understanding of how our bodies work. There are very many people who do not want to die of old age. Many of the people who don't want to die of old age are either rich, powerful, or both. And that means you can expect that quite a lot of resources will be spent trying to solve that problem. My guess is that I'm too old. My guess is that they will solve the problem a little too late for me, although I'm still hoping. But most of you are younger than I am, and I therefore think the odds are better than even that most of you, and for that matter my children and grandchildren, will not grow old. All right? That's going to be a very different world. Good in many ways, bad in some ways. You might consider that if the problem of aging had been solved about 60 or 70 years ago, Spain would still be ruled by Francisco Franco, and the most famous Georgian might still be the ruler of the Soviet Union, or at least might have been its ruler when it collapsed. And I'm not entirely sure what would have happened if a nuclear arsenal had been in Stalin's control at the point when the Soviet Union was collapsing. All right? So there are going to be disadvantages. People sometimes say that the reason that science makes progress is that old scientists die. And it'll be a different world when they don't. At the same time, every time somebody dies, a whole lot is lost. People you care about no longer exist. That's very sad. People who knew things no longer exist. People who might have done things no longer exist. So that will be a very different world. There are lots of other changes that will occur. For example, one of the questions that ought to occur to everybody is, what am I? What is a human being? And I think the best guess I have, but it's only a guess, is that what I am is a computer program running on the hardware of my brain. That if you think about how computer programs work, it looks an awful lot as though what I am is software. As though David Friedman, if you cut off my hand, I'm still me. If I cut off my leg, I'm still me. If you destroy my brain, I'm not me anymore. All right? So that strongly suggests that the brain is the computer, the structure of the brain is the personality, the person. We're getting better and better at making computers and programming them. If we know enough, we ought to be able to make computers that are people. Computers that think, believe, feel, do the same sorts of things that humans do. There are a number of ways we might do that. If this were a talk on that subject, I'd go into more detail, but we're going to have a question period for any of the things I've talked about that people want to talk about. In many ways, it would be very nice to have computers that were people, but there's one small problem, and that is that the computers keep getting smarter and we don't. All right? Ray Kurzweil, who's one of the pioneers in computer science in a number of ways, has predicted that he thinks that in about 30 years we will have human-level computers, artificial intelligence. if computers keep doubling their power and speed every decade or so, and they're generally been doing somewhat better than that so far, if in 30 years we have human-level AI, in 40 or 50 years we are gerbils. That is to say, we will be sharing the planet with people, with beings much, much smarter than we are. So that's another way in which the world could change, and indeed that's one of the things in my list of 3 different ways the human race might get wiped out if we end up creating computers that eventually are much smarter than we are and they decide that we are superfluous. That's one of the downsides of possible futures. I could go through many other things. I've got a long list. They include ways in which the human species could be improved. They include my favorite technology, possible technology, which is nanotechnology, which is the idea of being able to build machines constructed at the atomic scale, which turns out to have a great many interesting potentials, most of them good, some of them bad. But my basic conclusion that I've been arguing for is that predicting the future in any detail beyond the very near future is a fool's game. It's a zombie project. And that the best you can do is to say, here are things that might happen. I will think about if this happens what I might do, if that happens what I might do. I will then see what is happening, and I will do what then seems appropriate. So that's the basic argument I'm making. We will then try to take advantage of the good things in change, try to deal as best as we can with the bad things. I concluded a long time ago that the nice thing about answering a question from the audience is that when you're answering a question, you can be pretty sure that at least one person in the audience is interested in what you're talking about. So I will now end this part of the talk and take questions. Thank you.
Добрый день, меня зовут Евгений. Я прочел вашу книжку «Будущее несовершенно» примерно 10 лет назад. Потрясающая книга. Я по-прежнему ее очень люблю. Вопрос, что изменилось в вашем восприятии мира с тех пор, пожалуйста?
I don't think that Bitcoin existed then. I discussed the idea of eCash, but I was talking about Chaumian anonymous eCash. And the problem with that kind of eCash, it requires a bank. A bank has to exist someplace where people trust it. And pretty much all of the governments where such a bank could exist don't want anonymous eCash to exist, because if anonymous eCash exists, money laundering laws are unenforceable, and that makes it harder for governments to enforce the law. All right? Bitcoin was a brilliant invention which doesn't require a bank. Bitcoin, unfortunately, is not anonymous. Indeed, it's the least anonymous money that ever existed, since every transaction is public. But I think there are proposals for making things like Bitcoin that would be anonymous, so that's one thing that has changed. I'm just thinking about what else has changed. That's the immediate one that occurs to me. I think in a number of areas things are looking better. I think there's been some progress on aging. Actually, I saw a piece recently which described a result for mice that looked as though it didn't merely stop aging but reversed aging. And as you can imagine, that looks like a really good idea to me. At this point, my body is not much worse off than it was 20 years ago, but it's a little bit worse off, and it's clearly on a downward slope. So while I would rather get stuck, say, at 80 in a few years than get older and die, I'd like it even better if I can wind it back to 50 or 40 or so. But it may not turn out. All of this stuff is very uncertain. Let me think if anything else important has happened. I can't think of something, but I'd really have to give it more thought than I've given about the changes since I wrote that book. Another question?
Добрый У меня два вопроса. Вот сейчас Трамп встречался с Европейским Союзом по поводу климатических проблем, которые возникают, и он отказался, что Соединенные Штаты не будут финансировать вот эти программы. Как вы, как провидец, как считаете, если вот это не будет финансирования, то и Китай не финансирует вот эти программы, и Россия не финансирует. Вот к чему это может привести, потому что мир довольно маленький, и это приведет к негативным последствиям. И второй вопрос. Вы сказали, что вот если потепление, это хорошо, но есть такое понятие тепличный эффект, или как в теплицах, когда озоновые слои вот эти над землей, они уменьшаются, и на землю попадает очень много лучей от солнца, которые вредно воздействуют на землю. Поэтому вот вы не видите в этом проблемы, что вот этот тепличный эффект может привести к негативным последствиям для жителей Земли. Спасибо.
The greenhouse effect is the reason CO2 warms the globe. The greenhouse effect is the fact that CO2 is more transparent to the short wavelength light coming down from the sun than to the long wavelength light coming up from the earth. And that's why the existence of CO2 makes the earth warmer. That's the effect that people have been trying to estimate that causes warming. Going back to your initial question, I am not at all sure what the geopolitical effects are going to be. I think it is likely that at least for the next 4 years, the U.S. will be reluctant to take actions, at least expensive actions, to slow warming, because it's reasonably clear that the current president is opposed to doing so, and that his supporters are opposed to doing so. That one of the rather odd features of the climate debate, at least in the U.S., is that it somehow got linked to a bunch of other things, so that if you're a Democrat, you believe climate is a terrible problem, though you don't really know why, and if you're a Republican, you believe it's not a terrible problem, though you don't really know why. I was sort of struck. I used to argue climate issues online, and this year, my younger son was arguing that it was a good thing to give up something for Lent, that it was a useful experience to do without something you were used to doing. So I gave up arguing climate online for Lent. And on the whole, I enjoyed it because they were mostly not very useful arguments. So I've given it up since for my online discussion. But back when I was arguing it, one conclusion I came to was that the people arguing online, almost nobody on either side actually understood the greenhouse effect. That everybody was arguing more or less because I and people like me are on one side, and he and people like him are on the other side, and not really interested in the science or the arguments. That's happened since the side that didn't like the climate change controversy won the election. For a while, I think we won't have much action. I'm not sure about other countries. That I find it bizarre that the Scandinavian countries are trying to prevent climate change, because my guess is that they benefit by it. If you think, just look up the map at how much of Sweden and Norway and Finland is cold. And my guess is that what's going to happen in any case is that countries will mostly give lip service to it, but not do a whole lot. And the exception is when climate change can be used as an argument for doing things people want to do anyway. So governments, for example, always like collecting taxes. And if you can persuade people that you need a carbon tax to prevent global warming, that's one new excuse for a tax, so we may get some carbon taxes, I'm not sure. Governments like subsidizing firms, especially firms that donate money to their political party, and therefore, since climate change is an argument for subsidizing firms that do solar power, so you're going to get some of that. But I would be surprised if countries of the world did a whole lot of expensive stuff to prevent climate change, and as you can judge by what I've been saying tonight, I don't think they should. I think that the sensible thing is to watch and see what happens. Another question?
Thank you for your speech. My name is Alexander. said that changes is something that nowadays is considered as a bad thing. I would say that uncontrolled changes are considered to be a bad thing. When you said about global warming, I would say that the humanity is afraid of uncontrolled global warming. Isn't it like in the past people were facing decision whether to take the fire to the cave or to extinguish it? And maybe my views are a bit imperialistic, but I would like to hear it.
Yeah. To begin with, I don't see why uncontrolled change is automatically a bad thing. As you may have noticed at, I suppose about 3 o'clock today, it was raining very hard. By about 5 o'clock, it had stopped raining. That was an uncontrolled change. You didn't make it stop raining. Nonetheless, it was an improvement. So I would say that uncontrolled change is a random factor, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. I would further say that in many cases, the idea that you can control change is an illusion, that the world is a very complicated place. It is hard to know what is happening. That's part of what I've been saying tonight. And therefore, for the most part, you're going to have uncontrolled change, and the best you can do is to watch it and to try to deal with what that change is. Let me go back a step for the particular case of global warming for a moment. There's one respect and only one respect in which change is presumptively bad, in either direction. And that is that we have currently optimized what we're doing against current circumstances. So that at present, places that are hot, people have air conditioning. Places that are cold, people have well-insulated houses. And at present, the farmers are growing crops that are well adapted to the particular climate they're in. So that means that any change means that instead of everybody having already done the things that adjust, they now have to readjust. All right? So that's a negative effect. That would be a big effect if we were talking about rapid change. If sea level rose by 1 meter this year, there would be quite a lot of flooding in coastal areas. If temperature went up by 5 degrees centigrade this year, a lot of farmers would get very bad crops. But the actual scale of global warming, so far in the last 100 years, sea level has gone up by about 9 inches. So far, the change in global temperature has been about 1 degree centigrade per century. Now, it might be faster than that in the future, but it's not likely to be a lot faster than that. And if you think about 1 degree centigrade per century means that whatever people believe, no individual himself has observed it. Nobody can see a change in the average that small. The only reason we know it goes up is that we've got measurements from all over the world taken at a lot of different times, and you can then put them together and calculate it. So we're really talking about a very slow change. And farmers already change crop varieties for other reasons, because somebody comes up with a new variety. And if in 30 years temperature goes up by 1 degree centigrade, which is the kind of scale that might happen if it gets faster than it has been, in 30 years farmers will be changing crops anyway, and they will be changing to crops that are suited to a slightly warmer climate. You have to remember that the variation due to global warming is small compared to the existing variation due to geography. That after all, it's not as if nobody knows how to grow crops in a temperature that's 3 degrees warmer than Moscow, because there are lots of parts of the world that are already 3 degrees warmer than Moscow. When I'm talking to an American audience, I usually point out that the prediction for global warming, the high-end prediction for the end of the century, basically means that the state of Minnesota will be as warm as the state of Iowa now is. That's a pretty small change. People live in Iowa, they farm in Iowa. People in Minnesota can see what crops grow in Iowa and grow them. So I think that the fact that change is presumptively bad is a serious problem for rapid change. And the only place I can see it as a problem for climate change is not for humans, but for other species. Because humans can change what they do by looking and changing. Other species change what they do by evolution, or in some cases by moving their range, by animals living a little farther north or a little farther south. It's hard to estimate how big those effects are going to be, but it's conceivable that there might be serious negative effects because of some species of animals not succeeding in adapting. But beyond that, the world, already varies a great deal from place to place, and if people can live in climates several degrees warmer than Moscow, and as it happens, I live in a climate several degrees warmer than Moscow, there's no particular reason why people can't live in Moscow if it gets several degrees warmer. Another question?
Большое спасибо за вашу презентацию. Меня зовут Елена. Я учусь на факультете социологии. Вопрос. Вы говорили, что мы можем сравнить стратегию адаптации и, соответственно, сравнить это со стратегией управления. Два основных момента, два вопроса, которые можем задать себе. То есть, если мы говорим про адаптацию, то кто останется за бортом, кто не адаптируется, что с ними произойдет. Если мы говорим про управление, то всегда этот вопрос связан, кто управляет этим и в чьих интересах, а чьи интересы забыты. То есть, соответственно, кто выиграет, это кто проиграет. Мой вопрос по данной презентации будет, что не так может быть и плохо управлять будущим. Скорее плохо не знать, кто делает тот или иной прогноз, ради каких целей, и что нужно делать для того, чтобы управлять будущим. Вопрос, который я пытаюсь задать, заключается в следующем. Каким образом вы бы, скажем так, увязали эту презентацию с вопросом власти?
It doesn't matter who you're trying to benefit if you don't know how to do it. So that if you think about, if you want to say, will global warming hurt the poor? Well, global warming may well hurt poor people in India, because India is very hot. On the other hand, global increasing CO2 increases crop yields, which means food is cheaper, which helps poor people. You're talking about all sorts of complicated effects, and I don't think answering the question who is doing it, first, nobody is doing it in practice. In terms of controlling the future, you're really talking about somebody's doing this, somebody's doing that, we don't have a world government, fortunately. I think a world government is a cure worse than the disease. It would solve the problem of coordinating things on a global scale, but I don't think I like the way it does it. So for all of these, in practice, everybody is going to adapt. Some people will be able to adapt better and more easily than other people. That adapting in Canada and in Russia is going to mean taking advantage of the fact that there's some land you can use that you couldn't use before. That's a benefit. Adapting in India is going to mean people moving out of the hottest cities in India, either to other places in India or to other places in the world. In both cases, they're adapting. In some cases, the adaptation makes them better off. In some cases, it reduces the amount by which they're worse off. But I really don't think that this goes back to sort of one of my general concerns with arguments about things in America, and that is that people use the term social justice. And I have always found it hard to figure out what the difference is between social justice and justice. And one of my answers is that social justice is that approach to justice which, in response to any question at all, asks how does it affect the poor? And sometimes that's an interesting question, but sometimes there are other questions. And as far as I can tell, global warming is probably going to help some poor people and hurt some poor people. And adapting is going to work better for some people than others, and trying to control it is going to work better for some people than others. Anyway, I think that would be my answer to your question. Another question?
Hi, thank you for speaking. My name is Mikhail. I'm from the Libertarian Party of Russia, and I certainly agree that global warming is a much smaller problem than the EU makes it out to be, but I'm somewhat perplexed by your defense of uncontrollable change, because obviously there's certain ways to adjust to the global processes, and by using your own example, is if you get fat, you can control your diet, or you can just adjust the belt, and go with it. And those are two very different ways to adjust. And I think the same applies to all the processes. It's natural to try and find a better way of adjusting. And even though the whole idea of, we have to cut back on progress, to say, to stop global warming is misjudged, but at the same time, it's a perfectly legitimate approach to a better understood processes. Don't you agree?
No, that is the difference between the example of my belt getting tighter and the example of climate change is that I am reasonably certain that I am worse off being fatter, and I am reasonably certain that I know what to do about it. But in the case of climate change, I do not know if we are better off or worse off with climate change. And I know only in a very rough sense how to prevent it, and in fact the way of trying to prevent it probably won't work, not for scientific but for political reasons, because of the public good problem in coordinating people to do it. And therefore I am arguing that that is not a useful approach to it. If you imagine yourself as sort of God standing over the world and you've got a dial where you can set Earth's temperature, maybe it would be worth trying to lock that dial down, but you aren't in that position. If you think, one of the things people keep talking about how it would be a catastrophe if the polar caps melted. For most of the history of Earth, there were no polar caps. The definition of an ice age is a period when there is ice on the poles. All right? You may not, I don't know how many people realize that we are currently in an ice age. People often confuse an ice age with a glaciation. And an ice age is a period with ice on the poles. An interglacial is a relatively warm period within an ice age when the ice doesn't go too far down from the poles. We're currently in an interglacial. When we were in a glaciation, that meant that over the present location of London and Chicago, there was half a mile of ice. Probably Moscow, but I don't know about almost certainly St. Petersburg. I don't know about the case of Moscow. So in that sense, the history of the Earth has had very large swings in what climate is like. Living things manage through those. I see no particular reason to think that a distant future in which we could farm Antarctica would be a bad place. It would take quite a long time because it's mostly rock now, so you'd have to change it to other things. If the ice caps melted in 50 years, that would be a real problem because you'd have a big change in sea level. That would be a change that really would flood important areas. But we're talking about the ice caps melting in 10,000 years. In 10,000 years, if we're still around, populations will have shifted a very large amount, and we can evacuate the coast and go settle Antarctica and Greenland instead. So no, I don't see any particular reason. I don't think really controlling the future is very practical, and I don't think we know enough to know even how we would want to do it, let alone how to do it. At the individual level, that's not always true. Sometimes at the individual level, it does make sense to try to change you a little bit of the future, but it very rarely tries to make sense to change everybody's future. Another question?
Еще вопросы?
Он очень полезен. И его стали класть в косметику, и потом делали разные ванны радиевые и так далее. И кроме того, выяснилось, что он полезен для лечения рака. Но через какое-то время ученые сделали предсказание, что если это продолжится, класть радий в косметику, то, наверное, популяции человеческой будет не очень хорошо. И тогда волевым решением запретили использование радия для, и других радиоактивных элементов для косметических и прочих таких целей. И вот если бы тогда не вмешались и не стали бы так вот усилием воли правительственной контролировать это, то вообще неизвестно, чем бы все кончилось. Вот, прокомментируйте, пожалуйста, что было бы, если бы тогда стали приспосабливаться, а не контролировать.
Yeah, to begin with, of course, that was not a global problem. That was a local problem. If you use radium in cosmetics, that kills you. It doesn't kill me. So it's not the same kind of problem where everybody has to solve it together. Furthermore, in that case, I think that without the regulation, as people discovered that radium was dangerous, they would have chosen not to use radium. I don't know if they used it in cosmetics, but they used it in watch dials and in various other things where it was dangerous. So I think the more general question you're really raising is whether we are better off having decisions of that sort made by the government saying, here is a problem, let's deal with it, or having them made by individuals deciding what to do. And for my general response to that, if you go on my webpage, one of the talks that I actually gave quite recently, I think I gave it in Georgia, in fact, is what I refer to as market failure as an argument both for and against government. And the argument I'm making there is that the reasons that individual action sometimes does the wrong things, the reason that individually rational people sometimes don't produce group rational results, is a reason that also implies that in the political market, individual rationality does not always lead to group rationality. And indeed, that the problem that causes people to do the wrong things is more common in the political than the private market. Because the fundamental problem is that people make decisions where they do not bear the cost or do not receive the benefit. And since people are mostly interested in the effect on themselves, if I can do something that benefits me by $10 and hurts you by $20, I may well do it even though the net effect is to make us worse off. And the argument I offered in that talk is that those situations occasionally exist with private action, but that they are the normal situation with political action. That almost no politician bears the costs of the decisions he makes. So let me give you a particular example, two particular examples from my country, which are rather similar to yours, although they involve medical drugs rather than radium. The US government has rules on what medical drugs can be introduced. And a few years ago, the agency responsible for those rules had a press release in which they admitted that they had killed 100,000 people. They did not, of course, put it that way. The issue was whether doctors were supposed to prescribe something called a beta blocker, which was a medicine that was used to prevent a second heart attack. Beta blockers had been in use in the US in the rest of the world, in Europe, for more than 10 years, at the point when the FDA finally decided to approve them. And the FDA's press release about how good it was they decided to approve them estimated that they would save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. If beta blockers save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year, then the FDA, by keeping them from being used for a little over 10 years, had caused about 100,000 unnecessary deaths. That is an example of the problem that when the government makes decisions, it might make a better decision than private people, but it also might make a worse one. That most of the time when private people make a decision, such as whether to use a cosmetic with radium in it, they pay the cost, so they have an incentive to try to make the right decision. When the government makes the wrong decision, usually somebody else pays the cost, and therefore they have a much weaker incentive to make the right decision. But as I say, if you're interested, that's a talk that there is I think several actually recordings up on my webpage. One of the parts of my website is links to a bunch of talks I've given, so you don't have to bring me to Moscow to hear my talks. You can listen to the talks that I gave in Sweden and in Georgia and in America and maybe in India and maybe one in Bali. And I think I've got one or two talks from China without even going to all those places. Another question? Yeah.
Как вы считаете, то есть насколько, да, зачем вы это делаете, да, почему вот именно в виде talks там?
I plan my future, but as I thought I said, it is much easier to do that at the individual level than at the group level, and I don't have to change it and plan it nearly as far ahead. I have not, in fact, made any plans for 50 years from now, due to the fact that if they don't solve the aging problem, 50 years from now I'll be dead. And I assume that if they do solve the aging problem, after they solve the aging problem, I have plenty of time to decide what I want to do in 50 years. So, like most people, I try to plan my own future, but I don't claim to be able to predict the future of the world 30 or 40 or 50 years ahead. And in fact, part of the point of my book, Future Imperfect, was to argue that that future was much, much more uncertain than most people, myself included, tend to automatically assume. So I can certainly plan the future a year ahead. The odds that I'll drop dead in a year are very low, fortunately. I've had a couple of medical problems that have been solved. I'm in pretty good shape at the moment. I can even solve it a little further ahead because my older son is engaged and his fiancée has told me that she's planning to produce 6 more grandchildren for me, 3 sets of twins. And I think that's a little bit optimistic, but I can make plans on the assumption that I will probably have at least 2 or 3 more grandchildren, and I like children, so that would be a good thing. I can make many plans, but I am not going to make many plans even 20 or 30 years ahead, because it is possible that in 20 years I will be living in a world where nobody grows old anymore. It is possible that in 30 years I will be living in a world in which the computers are smarter than we are, and I'd better make sure they like me. There are a lot of things that as far as 20 or 30 years ahead could change a great deal, and I therefore can't do much planning that far. But a year I can manage.
Думаете, существуют ли какие-то социальные институты, может быть, которые будут или на данный момент помогают людям понимать, какие могут происходить изменения в будущем и адаптироваться к ним вообще?
There are some institutions that give you a little information. In particular, there are future markets. There are markets where people are agreeing to deliver oil or coal some point in the future, and that at least tells you what people who are making their living doing this think prices are going to be like in the future. So futures markets give you a little bit of information about the future, but I don't believe there is a 20 years future market for oil or for coal, because very few people believe they can predict that far. And similarly, there are going to be institutions for agriculture. I've never been a farmer, but I assume if you are a farmer, that there are places where you can get expert information on what crops grow well in what climates, and use that information to decide what to do. So I guess the answer is that just as with all other issues, we have imperfect ways of getting information, but the world is a very complicated place, and we are limited people, and sometimes the information we get turns out to be wrong. Not uncommonly, it turns out to be wrong. To take one example, back when I was young, what all of the experts said was that you should stop eating butter and eat margarine instead, because butter had saturated fat. It turned out that particular piece of information was not only wrong, it was lethally wrong, because it is true that butter had saturated fat, but the margarine we were eating was hydrogenated vegetable oil, which instead of having saturated fat has, anybody remember the term? It's the kind of fat. What? Trans fat. Right, it has trans fat, exactly. It has trans fat, which turn out to be much more dangerous than saturated fat. Nowadays, you can get margarine that doesn't have trans fat, and that's probably even safer still. But that was a case where the best information available turned out to be wrong, that people made a mistake, and they were slow to recognize the mistake, as people often are. So I'm afraid safety is not an option in this world, unfortunately, that all you can do is make the best gambles you can, and then as more information comes in, try to adjust what you're doing to the new information.
Okay, let's have the last 2 questions.
Них вопросы.
Я студент Высшей школы экономики, факультет права. И, во-первых, хотелось бы поинтересоваться относительно такого процесса, как опустынивание, потому что именно изменение климата, потепление связано с процессом опустынивания и эрозии почвы. Это тоже, это одна из больших таких...
Why would you... Sorry, you still going?
Я хотел спросить про эрозию почвы и процесса опустынивания, потому что они забирают почву, и на данных полях, которые превращаются в пустыни, человечество не может выращивать новые культуры, что является однозначно негативным эффектом. Во-вторых, хотел бы спросить про экономику. Все-таки государство, как такой управляющий институт, должно предвидеть и предсказывать некоторые экономические процессы для ведения собственной политики, социальной политики. И не кажется ли вам, что без предсказаний, без предвидения, без анализа того, что будет, невозможно реально вести государственную политику и государственную экономическую политику? И еще хотелось бы... еще хотелось бы такой вопрос задать. В Китае был опыт с воробьями, когда было предсказание, что, собственно, воробьи это плохо, и воробьи съедают множество жучков. И поэтому мы должны уничтожить воробьев, и чтобы выращивать больше урожая, чтобы повысить уровень сельского хозяйства. Воробьи были уничтожены, однако это привело к тому, что сельскохозяйственные культуры были уничтожены жуками. Так, возможно, все зависит именно от качества предсказаний, от того, что именно наука предсказывает и делает эти предсказания высокоточными. Спасибо.
Yeah, to begin with, I don't know why you expect climate change to increase deserts. As I mentioned, the prediction of drought was made by the IPCC in the fourth report and then withdrawn in the fifth report because it didn't seem to be happening. One of the predictable effects of increasing CO2, and one that is already happening, is to increase the amount of vegetation. Because since photosynthesis uses CO2 as an input, when there is more CO2, plants grow better, and plants growing better is likely to, I would think, reduce the amount of desert, not increasing it. So I don't see why you take it as sort of known that you're going to get more deserts when I know of no reason to believe that's the case. With regard to government policy, I think it odd that you think of the economy as meaning government economic policy. I would have said that government economic policy at least as often makes things worse as it makes things better. That the governments, after all, you live in a country which remained poor because the government was running the economy. All right? You didn't do as badly as China did. All right? When the government stopped running the economy in China, from the death of Mao to 2010, per capita real income went up 20-fold. And you were describing a mistake in that system, the killing of sparrows, which was a mistake that was precisely a result of the kind of thing I've been arguing against, namely governments trying to control things, control the world. That you have to think about mistakes as one of the costs of trying to interfere. It's at least arguable that the Great Depression in the U.S. was a result of institutions that were designed to prevent such things. That would be a longer story. I could talk about it if people were curious. So I don't think of the economy as something that governments control or fine-tune. The economy itself does deal with predictions. If it looks as though oil is going to get scarcer, future prices of oil goes up. People start using less oil because they want to save it and sell it in the future when it's more expensive. When anything changes in an economy, the way markets and prices work is that they adjust to what the new circumstances are. If somebody finds a new deposit of copper, the result is the world price of copper goes down a little bit. People use copper a little bit more and other things a little bit less. So the economy is a very complicated, decentralized coordination system. And the evidence of the history of communist Russia and communist China and of the attempts of India to develop with central planning suggests that the centralized coordination system works worse than the decentralized coordination system, not better, which is why Korea South Korea ended up poor, and ended up rich, and North Korea ended up poor. Why West Germany ended up rich and East Germany ended up poor, and so forth. Did we have one last question?
Собственно, вопрос. Вам не кажется, что люди, которые боятся глобального потепления, они скорее такие алармисты, они хотят сохранить статус-кво? И в этом плане не особо важно, убьет ли глобальное потепление человечество или нет. Сам факт того, что, например, в северных странах, в Швеции, например, изменится экосистема, для них это уже достаточно для того, чтобы вводить сильные ограничения для выброса СО2 и все такое. В этом плане ваши аргументы для них не были бы сильны.
That is, I think it is true that the instinct that says change is bad is a fundamentally conservative instinct, but I think the alarmist part is a matter of exaggerating the effects. That if you look at sort of popular discussion of global warming, very few people seem to realize that sea level rise so far is less than a foot in 100 years. Very few people seem to realize that you're talking about maybe a little over 1 degree centigrade now in 100 years, less than 2 degrees centigrade. So that the alarmism consists of either greatly exaggerating what has happened, or taking anything bad that's happened and assuming it's due to global warming, so that in the US, anytime there is some natural catastrophe due to weather, people talk as if it's due to global warming. But of course, if you go back 100 years, there were also hurricanes and floods and other things happening. And you have to really look not at whether they happen, but at whether they happen more often. And the answer seems to be probably not. So the alarmist part is a matter of greatly exaggerating the size of the effect. The conservative part is a matter of assuming that if there's change, it's bad. Thank you.
Да, прежде чем мы окончательно закончим, я хотел напомнить, что 19 июня мы продолжим эту серию лекций Редли Балка, которая называется «Зомби-прокурор», и поговорим о том, к чему приводит желание посадить всех преступников за решетку. И отдельно я хотел обратить ваше внимание, если вы зайдете на сайт InLiberty, вы увидите, что у нас продолжается конкурс на участие в летней школе, которая называется «Альтернативы», да, и которая целиком посвящена разным способам подумать, какими могут быть социальные институты, да, будь то государство, будь то право, будь то семья, армия, да, и в том числе разные институты, которые прогнозируют будущее. Поэтому, если вам вдруг это интересно, или вы знаете людей, которым это может быть интересно, регистрируйтесь, пишите эссе. Спасибо.